Hello, class. We're going to continue with our lecture on cultural competency. This is part two. I wanted to now begin slide number 12, and this is where we're going to start getting into more about the stance of the therapist, him or herself. And I think you had heard me say earlier in the previous lecture that the best cultural competency uh, classes or lectures I've ever taken have been ones where they try to get the student to tap into that part of them that is interested in people, is kind, is curious about the world, is empathetic. And those are some of the same characteristics we talked about at the very beginning of this course. Kind of what makes for a good therapist. I think the qualities that make for a very good therapist naturally lend themselves into being a culturally competent therapist. So, issues of professionalism, issues of authenticity and genuineness and warmth, issues of caring and having a lot of sympathy for clients, having a lot of empathy for clients, being able to engage in what we call theory of mind, which means the ability to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and think about what the world might look like from that person's perspective. These are all really important and really central characteristics for what it means not only to be a culturally competent therapist, but to be a good therapist in general. So that's where this shift is going to happen here. And I think I also mentioned too that just about the worst lectures I've ever heard on cultural competency, or the worst classes that I've ever taken, have been the ones where people asked you to memorize a set of lists, or a set of guidelines or principles. And those are fine. We do want to memorize those things. But really, what you'll see is that the therapists that are the most culturally aware and most culturally competent are the ones who take these issues to heart and live them out on a day by day basis. And so, yeah, I want to propose that it's going to be very difficult for you to be an effective therapist if this kind of perspective taking is not something you do regularly. It's um, it's kind of like, how to say it. It's like during a time of crisis, and I'm recording this lecture as the news is playing in the background, and we're watching protests erupting all over the United States, where people are very upset over yet another um, African American who has been killed by police officers. In this case, another white male police officer. Absolutely no reason, absolutely no basis for this kind of treatment by the police officer. Just a really, really horrible scene. And you're watching people with their collective sadness and their collective anger come together in places all over this country and all over the world, and they're speaking up, and their voices are being heard, and they're making sure that their voices are being heard. Well, what you'll often find in situations like this is very well-meaning majority people. Sorry, that's an incoming call. What you'll often find is very well-meaning people kind of rush into the scene, and even though they mean well, you can tell that the issues that are important to racial minorities are not a regular part of their lives. They're kind of tacking it on later. They're doing the things that maybe look good or that might win lots of approval from people. Maybe they're doing it to improve their brand or their image or their online profile. But taking an active interest in issues of race this is not a regular part of this person's life. And so when a big event like this happens, something um, that becomes a part of our collective conscience, when that kind of thing happens, you can see them kind of tacking it on later. And I want to suggest that if you're that kind of a person who comes to the party late, who just shows up when the cameras are rolling, that doesn't make for the kind of qualities of integrity and genuineness, the fruits of what it means to be a person who's genuinely interested in others. It doesn't mean that that's not welcome. It just means that you have to do more than just show up when the cameras are rolling. You have to make this a part of your life. Does it have to be the most important thing in your life? No, and you shouldn't pretend that it is if it isn't. But it should come from a very authentic place. And so this first point that I want to make here is that cultural competency emanates from one who is competent and it's not something that is tacked on because of a class. One of the reasons why I had you listen to those videos from the integration symposium this year is that I could tell right away that the speaker was someone who lived this. That she lived this out. She breathed this. This was a part of her life. And in a very unorthodox way, she presented herself as a culturally engaged individual. And it was so apparent that this could not have been faked. This came from a very genuine place. And to me, that's a far better example of how to teach cultural competency than merely picking up a book on the subject and trying to summarize the contents of the book. And your clients will tell. Your clients can tell if this is not something that's a regular part of your life. And so if this is not something that is at least a small regular part of your life, I would encourage you to change that. I would encourage you to commit yourself to trying to get to know people from another culture, to get to know people who are different than you, and not just for the sake of satisfying your own curiosity, but to see the world through their eyes. The next forum that we're going to be engaging in next week is going to tap into a little bit of that. So I hope you'll stay tuned. We want to act in the best interests of the patient as defined by the patient. Now, this is something that's very important to therapy in general and to counseling, and that is when you are listening to someone, it's very important that your listening is not done in a way that says, okay, I have successfully listened to you, I have successfully heard you, now we can move on, or now we can talk about me. No. Listening has only taken place when the person you're listening to says that you understand their perspective. So it's up to the other person's point of view, not your point of view, to decide when listening has taken place. So in the case of cultural competency, your cultural competency will come through and will be validated and will be verified when someone who is different from you looks at you and says, you get me, you understand me. Maybe not fully, maybe not completely, but we are now speaking a similar language. You can see the problem that I'm having. So again, this is another example of how cultural competency is really an extension of the larger radical empathy that's associated with being a very good therapist. You can't be a good therapist unless you are radically empathetic to another person's point of view. It just won't work. People will think that you're a phony. People will think that they can see right through you, and in a lot of ways they can't. They can see right through you when you just tack this on later. If you are unsure how to proceed, if talking about this is causing a little bit of paralysis in you, a little bit of fear, which can often happen to a lot of people, just ask for help, ask for guidance, ask for supervision. If you can't get that kind of help or guidance, and nevertheless you find yourself in a situation where you are faced with someone who is racially or ethnically or religiously different from you, and you don't know how to proceed, ask them. Ask them to help you understand. One of the great statements you can ever make as a therapist is, can you help me understand, ... Can you explain it to me in a way that helps clarify it for me? You can even preface it by saying, you know what, there's a lot of what you're saying that I'm pretty sure I don't understand because I've not lived in your shoes. Could you give me a taste or give me an idea of what it is like to see this world through your eyes right now? Even taking that kind of an interest in someone can cover a multitude of sins of ignorance. There's no substitute for yourself really getting to know it, really getting to know someone's perspective better by committing yourself to doing it on your own. But even when you don't know, you come in with a very open mind. This is called a not knowing position. And I want to really underscore this, the not knowing position. I've got to tell you a story. My wife and I love watching detective shows on TV. And our favorite detective of all time is a detective who was on TV in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And his name was Columbo, Lieutenant Columbo with the Los Angeles Police Department. In its time, in the late 1970s, Columbo was the highest rated show on television by far. It was an extremely popular television character. What made Columbo so good was not that he was an incredible detective. He was very short. He was very weak. When he walked into a room, He didn't command a lot of respect. He was usually dressed in a very rumpled way. He had this old trench coat that had stains on it. His hair was always all messed up. And he always came into the room feeling sick or tired or groggy. Like you could tell that it took him a few minutes just to orient himself to the situation. And so all the criminals that he would interview would start out believing that this guy was a terrible detective and he didn't know what he was doing. But as the case wore on and as the television show went on, his genius, the genius of Columbo, began to emerge. And what he would do is he would start out with the assumption that he had absolutely no idea about anything. So he would not assume that he knew things. He would ask innocent sounding questions, questions that are almost a little bit embarrassing, questions like that we would consider to be softball questions. And there's a parallel here. In the 1990s, there was and into the early 2000s, there was a very famous news reporter or a journalist named Larry King. Larry King is still alive, but his television show has long been off the air. But Larry King was very famous for being the most famous television interviewer and journalist in the world. He interviewed thousands of people over the course of his career, and many people complained that his questions that he asked were too easy, way too easy. Like if someone won the lottery, he would ask something like, "Are you happy that you won the lottery?" But what would end up happening, and that may sound like a really easy question, but what ended up happening is because he presented himself almost with a childlike innocence, and because he started out with this assumption that he didn't know everything, what he would do is he would prevent his own brain from trying to outsmart himself. And when you're too much thinking that you know things, you're going to overlook things that could actually be where the mystery gets solved. The second thing is that you also put the person that you're interviewing very much at ease. And so what would end up happening would be that the people that Larry King would interview, they would start to really relax, and then they would open up. And by the end of the interview, they would have said far more about themselves that was very personal and very deep than they ever would have planned on telling someone at the beginning of the interview. And that's because Larry King starts out with a not knowing position. It's a very humble, very approachable, very non-threatening way of talking. And at first, it may not be that people respect you right away. We tend to respect people that look like they're very confident and capable and carry themselves with a great deal of awareness and poise. But we very rarely tell those people a lot. Isn't that the case? Don't you know that to be true? When someone carries themselves in a very arrogant way, we very rarely give very much to them of ourselves. But when someone is very innocent, we often tell them way more than we would have ever told anybody else. There's a lot of profound truth in that, to start out with that not knowing position. Moving on now to slide number 13. Other characteristics. You want to balance your caution and your sensitivity with confidence. Tell your patient that you are aware of the cultural differences between the two of you, but then also say that therapy could be a learning experience for both of you. What does this mean? Well, first of all, one thing that you want to do as a therapist is instill confidence in your client that you know what you're doing and that you know what you're talking about. So it might be that you're a little bit reluctant to say what it is that you don't know at the beginning of a therapeutic relationship because maybe they won't come back. But the thing is that if you are teachable and you are open to where the client will take you, you may end up in the long run being a much more effective therapist than someone who starts out saying they know everything, or even someone who has a lot of training in this area. So on the one hand, yes, you want to be very cautious and sensitive to the fact that you don't fully know someone else. But you also want to balance that with the confidence that you're teachable and that you can learn and that this could be a good learning experience for the both of you. You want to convey both of these things to the client. If a patient wants help in an area that contrasts with your values, say for example that you're a very religious person and in accordance to some teachings within your religious tradition, there are certain practices that other people may find to be absolutely fine and central to who they are that may run counter to what it is that you've been taught or what you believe to be ethical or moral. So here's one of the most difficult and controversial aspects of being a counselor. Remember that there is a big difference between what you value and what your patient values. Your role is not to have your values come across In other words, successful therapy will not result in your client believing everything that you believe. It will not result in your client coming to uh, share the same faith as you. It will not result in your client having the same moral system. No, successful therapy happens when you help a client resolve their problems and reconcile them with their own moral values and their own moral system. You are providing assistance to them. This is not indoctrination. Therapy is not indoctrination. Therapy is not um, it's not a conversion experience. You are respecting the client for who they are, where they are, and you are respecting their values. You can help clarify values for them, but only the ones that they have chosen to employ. And so, in this sense, it's always important to proceed with what the client feels is correct, not what you feel is correct. Now, there are some issues, obviously, that could there could be some tension there. For example, here's an obvious and very ridiculous example that may sound very ridiculous and silly, but it actually is quite serious. How about this? What if you're a therapist and one of your clients falls in love with you and develops strong feelings of attraction to you, romantic feelings, sexual feelings, etc.? Um, those might be very real feelings, and this happens to a lot of therapists. And what if the person says, I want you to make love to me? You would say, oh my goodness, that's absolutely crazy. I would never do something like that. But then you might remember this lecture and say, well, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to do what's right in the eyes of the client? Aren't we supposed to abide by their value system? That may sound like a very ridiculous example, because no, if someone were to do something like that, that would clash with your value system, and of course with the professional standards, which say you can't be in a sexually intimate relationship with a client. So the key here to understanding it is not everything that your client wants is going to be value free. Sometimes what they want is going to clash with what you value or what might be legal or ethical. And so you have to weigh that very carefully. But in most cases, what a client wants and what the client needs help with, you will be able to help them resolve that with very few instances where that's going to represent something that is completely unthinkable for you. Now, this does start to get into professional ethics, and medical doctors have to face this kind of thing too. Like, for example, there are several cases where there are doctors who are able to perform abortions, but who believe abortion is a moral wrong. And there have been several court cases where people have sued doctors for not performing an abortion, even though they had requested to get an abortion. And the reason was that they needed to see that doctor because that doctor was the only person within, say, several hundred miles that could perform such an abortion. These are very real issues, and there's a lot to be said for the perspectives of people on both sides of this issue. So there's a lot of literature there. Just make sure you know that for the most part, the best attitude to have is you want to do what your client wants to do, not what you want them to do. By the way, you won't get very far as a therapist if you are only trying to do what you want to do. People will tend to not come back and see you. All right. Recognize that people approach therapy with skepticism and are afraid of being labeled and may have been hurt by the system before. What's very interesting is that you may come across clients who, in their own previous therapy experiences, have felt like that they were not respected or heard or understood. And so they're looking for a therapist who can really understand them well. Also, you want to recognize that some clients, for example, some people from Arab cultures, some people from Asian cultures, will come to therapy elevating your status extraordinarily and view you as being almost an omniscient expert, and will therefore expect more direct forms of instruction, which may contrast with a more non-directive style or approach. So this may happen to you if you've ever found yourself in a position of being an advice giver, and someone says, well, if you're the advice giver, then tell me what it is that I need to do. But another person might say, no, don't tell me what I need to do. I need to be able to figure it out for myself. So it largely is going to depend on the kind of person that you're seeing, and you want to adjust your style to what best fits this particular client. So some people will say, Please give me advice. And they're saying that only because they're a very dependent personality. In that case, you don't want to give them a lot of advice. You want them to be able to come up with their own advice. But if you were dealing with a person who treated you as an expert and really did value what it is that you had to say, they may feel like they were wasting their money if they came to counseling and asked for help and you didn't give them advice. So again, you want to consider who it is that you're seeing. That'll be very important. Okay, going down to slide number 15. Know your own cultural values. Never underestimate how naive you appear if you are a majority and unaware of your culture. Or how about this? If you're a majority and are unaware of the fact that you even have cultural values. I remember a lecture that was done back when I was in high school where someone had asked the question, what are your values? What is your culture? And a white male in my class answered, he said, I don't have a culture. I'm a white guy. And it's very interesting because to say that, you kind of understood where he was coming from. He just considered himself to be Joe average. Nothing particularly special about me. I'm just a white guy. But the problem with that is that, of course, it belies a really strong naivete. He hasn't explored the values and the assumptions of what it means to be a white male in America. He thinks that there are no values at all associated with that, when in fact there are. And so you could tell that he really had a lot of growing to do in this area. He needed to be brought face to face with the fact that he had a culture, whether he knew it or not, and it was very consequential. In fact, his cultural values were often very beautiful and wonderful, and then also, on the other hand, they could also result in lots of harm to other people and other cultures. So, very important. This is the English poet and philosopher Alexander Pope said he said to know then thyself. He said, know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man. That's Alexander Pope's probably his most famous quote. And he was quoting Aristotle, who said, know thyself. Or Shakespeare, to thine own self be true, taken from Hamlet. It's so important to know your own culture and to know who it is that you are and to know what your culture values and where that might contrast with other people's culture. And you can always tell that you are a racial majority with a lot of power and a lot of privilege when you don't think there's anything particularly special about your culture, when you think it's just quote unquote normal or average. Hardly. It's not normal or average. It has a huge set of assumptions that need to be explored. Secondly, a good therapist who's culturally aware needs to understand how racism works. Whether we're talking about racism in terms of intentional malice, or if racism could be something that's a little bit more insidious or technical, like prejudice plus power. That's one of the most famous understandings of racism, is that racism is a false belief or an antipathy toward a particular class of people based on race, ethnicity, or some other factor. And then you also have the power to implement that prejudice. By that definition, a minority culture could not engage in racism if they did not have the ability to act upon that racism. So it depends on how you're looking at the definition of racism. That's an important thing as well. But it's very important to understand that racism can be overt, or it can be covert or subtle or insidious, kind of appearing in places that not everyone sees. There are many examples where racial minorities can very much feel the sting of prejudice and oppression and racism, and the people who are responsible for it may have no idea. They may be completely clueless and detached from how their attitudes can be racist, which can also make for a lot of hurt feelings. An example of this could be institutional racism, where you have people who are in power who are typically very much dialed into the majority, and they think that everything is fair and they think that there's equal opportunity for everyone, but there are little and sometimes not so little ways in which that power status quo gets reinforced. And at the end of the day, despite what everybody says and despite all of these good intentions, the same people tend to be in power at the end of the day. Finally, here, you want to integrate multiculturalism into everything you do. Again, this is not just something that you tack on later. This is not something that's done piecemeal. It has to be something that emanates from inside of you, and it has to reflect, at least on a little bit of a scale, it has to reflect who you are. So again, the forum that we're going to be doing this week is going to tie into that, and I'll give you that in an email as well. Moving on now to the final slide here, slide number 16. And some final thoughts. First, majorities, here I'm talking about in our country, these would be white males, often feel defensive and paralyzed regarding their racist attitudes. Some who are not overtly racist nevertheless feel under attack from minority groups who are concerned about racism, or who are concerned about institutional racism, or maybe some unintentional forms of racism. Racism exists on many different levels. It can be very overt and obvious and malicious, which sounds scary, but it may not be as scary as the more insidious and subtle forms of racism. I heard one person put it this way. The problem that many racial minorities face are not the Adolf Hitlers of the world, because even though they're very evil, we know what they're about. We know what they stand for. What we have to watch out for is the person down the street who says, oh, I'm nothing like Adolf Hitler, but then you look at that person's life and you see that in so many ways their actions reflect deeply held racist attitudes. And so it's kind of like the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. So one thing, too, to remember if you are a racial minority is that there's a great deal of sensitivity that can sometimes exist in racial majorities when the subject of racism is brought up. I could tell even on social media here the last few weeks, if you even hint at the fact that someone who is white might be racist, oh my goodness, how swiftly they will deny that charge, and how swiftly they will say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't know why people, whenever they talk about racism, they start talking about the musculoskeletal system. But they end up saying, I don't have a racist bone in my body. And it's really astonishing the level of defensiveness. People just really don't want to be pegged as being that way, and they don't want to be slapped with that label. But the reality is that they're often very much disengaged from just how racist their attitudes are, even if they are not intentional. Some of them obviously are intentional. I think for a lot of people, it's unintentional, but it's also unexplored. And that's the problem. If you're going to be a good therapist, you have to be someone who's willing to explore your blind spots. You have to be willing to explore your assumptions and correct those assumptions. You have to be willing to change your mind. If you're the kind of person who doesn't know how to change his or her mind, being a therapist is going to be a very rough road for you. Second, consider how your perceptions of others will change if you realize that everyone is hurt by racism. One of the problems that many white males in our society, one of the big problems they have is that they fail to understand how they themselves have been hurt by racism. They tend to view life as being a zero-sum game where if there's a winner, then that must mean that there is a loser. And if there's a loser, there must be a winner. And they don't recognize how this is a shared burden. This is a horrible, horrible, horrible shared burden. Consider this. Sigmund Freud, who talked for many years about the devastating effects of having a guilty conscience over the course of a person's lifetime, he would say that in many respects, racial minorities are much, much healthier than racial majorities. And the reason why is that racial minorities have, for hundreds of years, had to come to terms with the fact that they have been victimized and they have been traumatized. And so at the very least, they can begin the road towards coping. And that's a very difficult thing to do if justice has still not prevailed. If there's no justice, it's very, very difficult to begin to heal. But at the very least, they've had to learn to cope. They've been learning to cope, and they've been talking about it, in some cases, for hundreds of years. But if you are someone who denies racism, if you are someone who has perpetrated racism intentionally or unintentionally, and you deny it, then you have you have blocked yourself from any kind of healthy self-awareness. which means that you are likely internalizing a great deal of trauma. Trauma that you may have committed, trauma that your ancestors may have committed. So that violence, all that stuff that you're trying to deny, is going to manifest itself in some very ugly ways that will eventually destroy a soul. Um, it's the people who tend to be the guiltiest among us tend to take it out on others the strongest. That's a very good rule of thumb. The people who tend to be the guiltiest among us tend to take it out on others the strongest. So if you see a person who is filled with anger and filled with rage toward other people, you usually have a very good idea of their own sense of guilt. Not that they may feel that they've done anything wrong, but usually the likelihood that they have done something wrong. It's very profound. It's a good lesson to consider going forward. Once we have accepted the fact that racism is not just destructive to the people who've been oppressed, but is something that hurts everyone, that racism has hurt all of us, that we become more poor as a country. By that, I don't just mean economically poor. We can begin to heal. Now, that is not the only necessary step for healing. There must also be trust and justice. Rights have to be wronged before trust can begin to emerge. But that is one step on that road toward beginning to heal. This last point is something that is has probably been more helpful for me in my own road to trying to understand people from their own perspectives. And this is a gift that was handed to me from my parents and my grandparents, and they instilled in me from a very early age a love of traveling. And not just a love of the kind of travel where you go to different places and go to the tourist sites and check them off your list and then go home and say that you saw that culture, but the kind of travel that immerses yourself into another culture. And I felt like this was one of the great gifts that could be given to me, because the hundreds, if not thousands of people that I've gotten to know over the course of my life from my many travels, what a gift that has been, and how it has changed my life for the better. And if you can do that, there are many more tables around the world that you will be invited to sit down at when they know that you're someone who's genuinely interested in them, genuinely wants to hear their story, genuinely concerned about what they're concerned about, and then backs it up. This is one little thing that I think can really help you. So if you travel and explore and expose yourself to other peoples and other cultures, if you're willing to be a fish out of water every once in a while, if you are a majority person and you have not ever been in a situation in which you've been a minority, try doing it sometime. Try being in a situation where you're the only person in the room who looks like you or talks like you or believes the same God that you believe. And do it in a way that is more immersive, not like classroom experiences don't count as much in situations like that, because for a lot of majorities, even if they're the only white male in a class, they know that the class is going to end in an hour or two, and then they can go back to still being the person who is typically associated with being privileged and in charge. I'm talking about going to a country where your whiteness and where your maleness is not necessarily an attribute that you would want, or at least it doesn't give you very much power in that culture. Then start to experience what it's like to be a racial minority in a consequential way. Okay, that will wrap up our lecture for now on cultural competency, at least part 2. Stay tuned. We're going to start getting into Sigmund Freud in the next lecture.